Grab a seat. I just finished reading that Boyce and Swenson paper you recommended, the fine-tuning argument against the multiverse. And honestly, it completely flipped my perspective on cosmology and philosophy. For the longest time, the standard narrative has been that because our universe is so exquisitely fine-tuned for life, with all these fundamental constants perfectly balanced on a razor's edge, it naturally points us toward the idea of a multiverse. The logic always seemed intuitive to me. If you have an infinite number of universes bubbling into existence, it is practically inevitable that at least one of them will have the right conditions for life, and we just happen to be in the lucky one. But this paper argues the exact opposite. They are claiming that the fine-tuning of our universe doesn't just fail to support the multiverse, but actually serves as evidence against it. That is a massive claim. I need you to walk me through their exact logical cascade, starting from the very baseline, because I want to make sure I am not missing any crucial steps in their dialectic. Let us start with the standard fine-tuning argument, just looking at a single universe.
I am so glad you read it, because it is an incredibly elegant piece of philosophical architecture. To really grasp what Boyce and Swenson are doing, we have to follow their argument step by step, without compressing anything, exactly as they lay it out. So step 1 is establishing the baseline under the assumption of a single universe. If we assume there's only one universe, the fact that it is fine-tuned provides incredibly strong support for what they call a teleological hypothesis, which just means some kind of design, purpose, or fundamental principle that aims at creating life. Why? Because if there is no purpose and only one universe, the odds of these constants falling into the microscopic life-permitting windows by pure chance are staggeringly low. But if there is a teleological force, a designer, or a guiding principle, the probability of the universe being life-permitting is much higher. So, on the single universe assumption, fine-tuning strongly favors purpose over blind chance. That is the foundational claim.
Right, that makes total sense. If I walk into a room and see a deck of cards perfectly sorted by suit and number, and I know this is the only deck in existence, I am going to assume someone intentionally arranged it, rather than a gust of wind blowing it into that order. But that is exactly where the standard multiverse objection comes in, which is step 2 in our cascade. People who want to avoid the teleological conclusion, the non-teleological camp, will say that we do not just have one deck of cards. They argue that fine-tuning strongly supports a non-teleological multiverse. Their escape hatch is that if there are trillions of universes with varying constants, a life-permitting one is bound to pop up eventually. And of course, as observers, we could only ever find ourselves in the one that allows for our existence. But Boyce and Swenson point out that this popular objection runs straight into a massive wall built by philosophers Ian Hacking and Roger White.
Exactly, and that wall is what Hacking famously called the inverse gambler's fallacy. This is absolutely central to the paper. Think about it this way. Imagine you walk into a casino, and a guy at a craps table rolls a pair of dice, and they come up double sixes. It would be a complete fallacy for you to think, wow, that is a rare roll, therefore there must be millions of people rolling dice in this casino tonight. The fact that an improbable event happened right here, right now, with these specific dice, tells you absolutely nothing about how many other dice are being rolled in the background. Hacking and White apply this directly to the universe. Under a non-teleological assumption, where everything is just blind chance, the probability of this specific universe being life-permitting is entirely independent of how many other universes exist out there. Adding a billion dead universes to the background does not change the likelihood of this particular universe rolling a double six. Therefore, the fine-tuning of this specific universe cannot act as evidence for a non-teleological multiverse.
That is such a sharp critique. It completely severs the intuitive link between our luck and the existence of other universes. But the dialectic doesn't stop there, which brings us to step 3. Because Michael Rota enters the chat with a fascinating twist. Rota basically says, okay, maybe a non-teleological multiverse doesn't work, but what about a theistic multiverse? Rota argues that if the multiverse is created by a purposive being, like God, then fine-tuning strongly favors that theistic multiverse over a naturalistic one. His reasoning is that a designer would value life, and therefore would ensure that a very high proportion of the universes they create are life-permitting. He is basically saying that if there is a mind behind the multiverse, we should expect a reality densely packed with life-supporting universes, which makes our fine-tuned universe highly expected.
And that leads perfectly into step 4, which is Boyce and Swenson's pushback against Rota, introducing what is known as the life density problem. They argue that even if you introduce a teleological factor, a designer who wants life, it does not guarantee that reality will be densely packed with life. They give both a priori and empirical reasons for this. From a prior conceptual standpoint, they suggest something like a principle of plenitude, meaning a designer might value immense variety over sheer density. Maybe the designer wants a massive canvas of diverse, lifeless universes with just one tiny pocket of life, rather than a factory churning out identical life-permitting universes. And then, crucially, they look at the empirical evidence, the actual reality we live in. When we look at our own universe, life is astonishingly sparse. The vast, overwhelming majority of our cosmos is a deadly vacuum filled with radiation. Add to that the complete failure of SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, we have found absolutely nothing. If teleology inherently demanded a high density of life, our own universe wouldn't look like a barren wasteland with one tiny blue dot. Therefore, the life density problem shows that a teleological agent does not necessarily guarantee a high proportion of life-permitting universes in a multiverse scenario.
Wow. So they are using the extreme sparseness of life in our own universe to argue that a hypothetical designer isn't obsessed with maximizing life everywhere. That is a brilliant pivot. And that sets the stage for step 5, which is really the core conceptual innovation of this entire paper. We have established that fine-tuning supports teleology in a single universe. We have debunked the non-teleological multiverse with the inverse gambler's fallacy, and we have shown through the life density problem that a designer doesn't necessarily make a multiverse packed with life. So now, Boyce and Swenson ask the ultimate question. Given that there is a teleological factor at play, is the probability of this specific universe being life-permitting higher if it is the only universe, or higher if it is part of a multiverse? And they conclude it is higher under the single universe hypothesis. You have to explain the mechanics of this to me, because this is where they introduce that really specific term, the F hypothesis.
This is the absolute heart of the paper, so let us take it slow. Let us assume we have a teleological agent, a designer who intends to create life. Now, if the single universe hypothesis is true, and this universe is the only canvas the designer has, then the designer's intention to create life must be actualized right here, in this specific universe. All the teleological focus is concentrated on this one reality. Therefore, the probability of this universe being life-permitting is very high. But now imagine the multiverse hypothesis is true, and the designer has an infinite number of universes to play with. Because of the life density problem we just discussed, we know the designer doesn't have to put life everywhere. This opens the door to a crucial intermediate assumption they call the F hypothesis. The F hypothesis is the proposition that a teleological agent might have a preference for making other universes life-permitting rather than making this specific universe life-permitting. If the F hypothesis is true, the teleological agent's focus is dispersed. They might choose to fulfill their purpose in universe number 7 billion, leaving our universe completely dead. Because this F hypothesis is a real possibility in a multiverse scenario, it inevitably dilutes the probability that this specific universe will receive the gift of life. Therefore, mathematically and logically, given a teleological factor, the probability of this universe being fine-tuned is strictly higher if it is the only universe in existence than if it is just one of many.
That is incredibly elegant. If I only have one dart, and my goal is to hit a dartboard, I am going to throw it at the only board in the room. But if there are 1,000,000 dartboards, the chance of me hitting this specific board in front of you goes way down, because my attention and intention can go anywhere else. Okay, so moving to step 6, how do they formally derive their final conclusion from this? Because earlier you mentioned the standard Bayesian framework, specifically the likelihood principle, which states that evidence E favors hypothesis H1 over H2 if and only if the evidence is more probable under H1 than H2. How do they lock all these steps together into a formal proof?
They apply the likelihood principle directly to the probabilities we just established. Let us summarize the claims. Claim 1. Fine-tuning strongly supports teleology under a single universe. Claim 2. Via hacking and white. Without teleology, the probability of this universe being fine-tuned is the same, regardless of how many universes there are. Claim 3. The core innovation we just discussed. Given teleology, the probability of this universe being fine-tuned is higher in a single universe than in a multiverse because the F hypothesis threatens to disperse the designer's focus. Now, they add a fourth claim, which is a standard prior independence assumption, essentially stating that before looking at the fine-tuning evidence, the probability of teleology is independent of whether there is one universe or many. When you feed all four of these claims into the likelihood principle, the math rigorously dictates the outcome. The probability of the evidence, which is the fact that this universe is life-permitting, given the single universe hypothesis and our background knowledge, is strictly greater than the probability of the evidence given the multiverse hypothesis and our background knowledge. Because the evidence is more expected under the single universe model, the likelihood principle demands that the fine-tuning of this universe confirms the single universe hypothesis over the multiverse hypothesis.
That is a stunning reversal of the pop science narrative, but I want to make sure we hit step 7 and get the exact strength of their conclusion right, because philosophy is all about precision. They are not coming out and saying the multiverse is definitively disproven or that fine-tuning is an absolute refutation of it, right? But it is also not just a minor, negligible doubt. How exactly do Boyce and Swenson frame their final stance? And what is this distinction between direct and indirect confirmation that they bring up at the end?
That nuance is critical. We cannot overstate their claim, but we cannot weaken it either. The author's actual, literal conclusion is that there is an important sense in which the fact that this universe is fine-tuned for life tends to count as evidence against the multiverse hypothesis. It tends to count as evidence against it. Now, why the careful phrasing? This is where the distinction between indirect versus direct confirmation comes in. The argument we just walked through proves that fine-tuning exerts a direct, negative evidential pressure against the multiverse. However, they explicitly concede that an indirect path might still be open. For example, fine-tuning provides massive evidence for a teleological hypothesis. If, for some completely separate philosophical or theological reason, you believe that a teleological agent would inherently desire a multiverse for reasons unrelated to life density, then teleology might support a multiverse. In that scenario, fine-tuning supports teleology, and teleology supports the multiverse. That is indirect confirmation. But their undeniable achievement in this paper is proving that when you look at the direct, unmediated impact of the fine-tuning data itself, it pushes the needle toward a single universe. The evidence itself is anti-multiverse.
It is like they have painstakingly mapped out the exact pipelines of probability. The direct pipe from fine-tuning to the multiverse doesn't just have zero flow. It is actually pumping backwards, even if there might be some complex, indirect plumbing happening elsewhere in the background. It is such a rigorous exercise in forcing us to look at what the evidence actually says, rather than what we culturally assume it says. The fact that they can take something as vast as the cosmological constants, run it through the inverse gambler's fallacy, introduce the life density problem, formulate the F hypothesis, and cleanly drop it all into the likelihood principle to completely invert a popular scientific narrative is just top-tier philosophical work. It really makes you appreciate the danger of compressing arguments and skipping steps. If you just jump from, the universe is fine-tuned, to, therefore there must be a multiverse, you are bypassing a massive landscape of dialectical traps. Thank you for breaking down that cascade so precisely. It gives a whole new weight to the solitude of our single, sparsely populated universe.